I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 6, If. We last left off with the end of the Peloponnesian War. This inter-Greek conflict had raged across the Hellenic world, reaching as far away as Sicily and the Anatolian colonies. It had left the Hellenic Empire in shambles, and the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League unrivaled. Sparta's attempts to maintain control over their new domains were unsuccessful in many cases. After only ruling for a year, the oligarchic council selected to rule Athens was overthrown, and the city would regain much of its autonomy in the following years. The Peloponnesian War had sapped the strength of every major power in Greece, and even Sparta did not escape its impact. As detrimental as the loss of life was, the loss of Sparta's reputation as the invincible military power of Greece was of even greater consequence. It was a slower decline that came to Sparta, but over the course of the next 30 years, they regularly faced opposition that steadily eroded their power. They were unable to withstand the onslaught that the cities of Argos, Thebes, Corinth, and their old nemesis Athens brought against their attempted domination. This reaction to Spartan expansionism was called the Corinthian War, and I won't go into its details, but the important result of it was that Persia used it as a perfect opportunity to further divide and weaken the Greeks. They gave monetary aid to the rebels and helped force a peace treaty in which they dictated terms as a neutral party. This treaty, called the King's Peace, ceded all the Ionian cities in Asia Minor, as well as Cyprus, to Persia. In addition, the unification attempts started by the rebels during the war were undone by the treaty. The treaty is a great example as to what the Persian intentions were for the near future. They saw united Greece as not only more difficult to conquer, but even a threat to Persia's own security. They knew that any attempt to divide the Greeks using Persian armies would inevitably drive them together, so they used diplomacy and financial aid to hinder any Greek state from overtaking the others. The success of this strategy was very pleasing to the Persian kings, but it was deeply embarrassing to the Greeks, who were well aware of the intentions of Persia, but could not refuse the lure of Persian gold. The sun finally set on the Spartan Empire when 16 years after the King's Peace, the newly democratic city of Thebes declared themselves independent from Sparta. The Spartans attempted to enforce their will upon the city with a 12,000-man army. In the pivotal battle of Leuctra, the Thebans broke with the military tradition that each side would put their best warriors on the right flank so that they wouldn't face each other. Instead, the Thebans heavily massed their best troops, as well as cavalry, on the left flank. Due to this change in strategy, the Thebans obliterated the veteran line of Spartans, killing many of their best troops, including their king. It was the killing blow that marked the end of Spartan hegemony over Greece. The Spartans were so desperate to stop their backslide, as well as check the growing power of Thebes, that they made an alliance with their old enemy Athens. This alliance was inevitably unsuccessful, and after their defeat at the Battle of Mantinea, it broke up. This battle was devastating to both sides, as the Spartans and Athenians lost their chance to reign in Thebes, and the Thebans lost their most talented general, severely weakening their military capabilities to the point where they were unable to continue their rise to power. All in all, the result of these post-Peloponnesian War conflicts was that all the traditional power players of Greece wore each other down to the bone in their attempts to unite all of the Hellenic world through force. The resulting power vacuum left room for a new player to challenge for the title, and no, unfortunately it was not Byzantium. We will have to wait a little longer for them to step up. This new player was none other than the Kingdom of Macedonia. This old kingdom has been in the periphery of our story so far, and we last heard about them in the beginning of the Second Greco-Persian War, where they played the role of the duplicitous Persian vassal. After gaining their independence, Macedonia was content to let Sparta and Athens beat each other to a pulp, while they bided their time and waited for the right moment. The right moment would come during the reign of the first great man we will talk about in this episode, Philip II of Macedon. Philip was not born to be king, as he was the youngest son of his father, King Amyntas III. Upon the death of his father in 370 BC, Philip's older brother Alexander II took the throne and was immediately contested by a man named Pausanias. Alexander also had to contend with raids from Illyrian tribes to the north. Alexander II received aid from Athens at this time, and with their help was able to defeat his enemies. He would later be forced to break this alliance by Thebes, who worried about Athens and Macedonia growing too close as to threaten their power. In addition to being forced into an alliance with Thebes, Alexander also had to give them hostages, which included Philip. While he was a prisoner in Thebes, Philip received an education from leading Theban generals. This education would prove invaluable once Philip gained the throne, but at this time he was still far down the line of succession. His first step towards the throne came when his brother was assassinated at a war dance. Philip's other older brother, Perdiccas III, was too young to become king at this time, so the mastermind of the assassination, Ptolemy of Aluros, took the throne as regent. He would only get to reign for 4 years before Perdiccas took his bloody revenge, killing him and taking the crown. Perdiccas would have almost as brief a reign as Ptolemy, as he died leading a failed reconquest of northern Macedonia after only 5 years as king. During his short time in charge, he did at least have the good sense to secure the line of succession by naming his infant son his successor and his younger brother, Philip, as regent until he came of age. Philip inherited a shrinking kingdom that faced enemies on all sides. Believing that he was not powerful enough to stop this crisis as a mere regent, Philip declared himself king in 359 BC and immediately set about stemming the bleeding that had gone on since the time of his father. To do this, he promised tribute to the raiding tribes and expelled the 3,000 Athenian hoplites that had been occupying parts of central Macedonia. With the immediate danger taken care of, Philip set about reforming his army. Using the knowledge he had gained while a hostage in Thebes, Philip doubled the size of both the infantry and cavalry and implemented a wider range of disciplines beyond that of the traditional phalanx. The prevalence of archers, light infantry, and especially cavalry in Philip's army allowed for an interesting proto-combined arms tactics that dominated over the static phalanx style of warfare. He additionally instituted the practice of promotion based on merit and increased the monetary compensation those promoted received. He also introduced improvements in weaponry. If you look back through history, you find that, until the advent of gunpowder, the most powerful weapon was a stick with a pointy end. What began as the simple spear, a long shaft of wood with either a sharpened end or a sharp stone tied to the tip, was first innovated into the arrow, a smaller version that could be launched with the use of a bow. Whether thrown or thrust, the spear remained a staple of the ancient infantry warrior. At the time that Philip was making his improvements, the Greek phalanx, which relied heavily on spears, had been the dominant infantry formation for almost 2,200 years. To put that in perspective, that is nearly the amount of time between Philip II and the Napoleonic Wars. Over these 2,000 years, no one had yet attempted what Philip was about to attempt. Brace yourself, because this is military genius at its most impressive. Philip's idea was to make the spears longer. Philip equipped his army with spears called sarissa, which were about twice the length of traditional dory spears. The drawback of these longer spears was that they could no longer be thrown, but their increased length allowed for even more rows of the phalanx to engage the enemy at a time. They were so heavy and unwieldy, though, that the soldiers had to strap their shields around their necks and use both hands to carry the spear. But the decrease in defensive ability was overcome by the fact that they outranged the opposing phalanxes. I don't want to put too much emphasis on the longer spears, although they were important. What is true of any army, even those in ancient days, is that it matters just as much who wields the weapon. Philip introduced to Macedonia the idea of a professional military that was permanently on duty. No more farmer soldiers who had to ditch the campaign season when it was time to harvest their crops. This also allowed the army to drill and train regularly together, honing them into an efficient instrument of death. It was with these military innovations that Philip II of Macedon would lead his armies to conquer all of Greece. Philip's first campaign took him to the lands ruled by his wife's family. These were the lands ceded to the Illyrians by his predecessors, and Philip had come to reclaim them. The Illyrians, who had threatened to conquer all of Macedonia just a few years earlier, were no match for Philip's reformed army, and he decisively defeated them in a battle that saw 7,000 Illyrians die, which was a staggering casualty number for the day. After securing the lands lost by previous generations of Macedonian kings, Philip turned his focus to neighboring cities that he could expand his authority to. His first target was the city of Amphipolis and its lucrative mines. We last heard of Amphipolis back in the first phase of the Peloponnesian War, where Sparta had captured the city and forced Athens to the negotiating table. The negotiated Peace of Nicias stipulated that the city would be returned to Athens, but the Spartans dragged their feet on this point until hostilities resumed, so the Athenians never regained this important source of cash. Nearly 70 years later, the Athenians were still looking to retake the city, and so Philip signed an agreement with them that stated that the Athenians would give him the formerly Macedonian city of Pydna in exchange for capturing Amphipolis. But Philip was a ruthless conqueror who did not hold much respect for deals contingent entirely on honor. So after taking Amphipolis, he wheeled around and also conquered Pydna. This enraged the Athenians, and they promptly declared war on Macedonia. Athens was no longer the great power they had been 70 years before, and Philip had the added benefit of the help of one of Athens' rivals, the Chalcidian League of Olynthus. During this conflict with Athens, Philip married a new woman who bore him a son named Alexander. We will have more to talk about with Alexander later in this episode. After sweeping Athens out of Macedonian territory, Philip continued to rampage through northern Greece and Thrace, thoroughly smacking the Athenians about. He was briefly distracted from his campaign in 354 BC by the neighbor directly to his south, the Thessalian League. The League was embroiled in a large conflict against Phocis called the Third Sacred War, and they called on Philip to help them recapture their city of Pagasae. In return for his help, Philip gained an alliance with the current most powerful polity in Greece, Thebes. The following year, the Thessalonians again called for Philip's help, and he again marched south to defeat the Phocians. This time, despite suffering an initial defeat, the Phocians were able to strike back and trounced Philip in 2 consecutive battles. Philip was forced to slink back to Macedonia and raise another army. The Phocians may have hoped that their 2 victories against Philip had persuaded him to leave them alone, but in reality they had only kicked the hornet's nest. Philip came roaring back the next year with an army of 23,000 men and 3,000 horses. An immensely bloody battle came when the 2 sides met on Crocus Field. Philip's superior cavalry were the deciding factor, and 6,000 Phocians died in the fighting, with another 3,000 prisoners being executed after the fact. This battle would consequently mark Macedonia's rise to Greek great power status, as Philip was named Archon, or ruler of the Thessalian League, and expanded his territory all the way to central Greece. Philip was unable to continue this expansion immediately because an Athenian army had occupied the pass at Thermopylae, that crucial entrance to central Greece, which had stymied the Persian invasion in the Second Greco-Persian War. While at this time the Macedonians were not currently at war with the Athenians, Athens was threatened by their rising power and so occupied the pass to prevent a preemptive strike from Philip. With the way south blocked, Philip once again turned his attention north, to the Balkans, and to the northern coast of the Aegean. In a classic case of history repeating itself, Philip's goal was taking the lands ruled by his wife's family, this time Alexander's mother's home of Olynthus. Upon taking the city, Philip had it and its neighbors burned to the ground to completely erase his former allies, the Chalcidian League, from the map. The successful northern campaigns had secured Philip's position, and he was now ready to return to the south to finish business with the Phoenicians. 6 years after his victory on the field of Crocus, Philip was able to use his unrivaled military might and political power to enforce peace between Phocis and Thebes, ending the Third Sacred War. Well, Philip's army may have been unrivaled up north, but Sparta still had an impressive reputation in the south. Philip, however, was not impressed, and he sent a message to Sparta, declaring that, quote, "If I invade Laconia, I shall turn you out," end quote. The Spartans simply replied, "If." This probably made the Spartans feel really cool, and made them look like total badasses to the rest of Greece. That is, until the Macedonians actually did throw them out of Laconia and totally embarrassed them. However, the city of Sparta itself would remain resolute, and Philip would never conquer it, leaving his son Alexander to finish them off as the last holdout in southern Greece. With peace again established on his southern flank, Philip now looked to expand to the north. He successfully captured many cities in Thrace, adding much of the province to his growing Hellenic kingdom. However, as he moved east, he was first turned back by the city Perinthus, and then again at Byzantium. For once in our story, Byzantium was able to resist an invading great power, this time with the help of Athens. The failure to capture these two cities undermined Philip's reputation among the still independent parts of central and southern Greece, and soon Athens and Thebes would join each other for one last chance to stop Philip from conquering the entire region. Despite the fact that Thebes and Athens had been bitter rivals for centuries, they were both democracies, and Thebes decided to side with their old enemies to stop what they viewed as a tyrannical enemy of liberty. Initially, this southern campaign was a stalemate, as Athens and Thebes held defensive positions that prevented Philip from entering Boeotia. Philip poked and prodded these defenses through the winter of 339 BC and the spring of 338, but eventually he grew frustrated and decided to go for an all-out assault down the main road. This aggressive march brought him head-to-head with the bulk of the allied army near the town of Chaeronea. The Macedonians were 32,000 strong, 2,000 of which were cavalry. The historical sources on the allied army are not quite as exact, but most agree that the southern Greeks had around the same number of men. Since the allies were on defense, they were able to pick the location of the battle, and they had chosen well. Using the terrain just as their ancestors had against the Persians, they were able to protect both their flanks from cavalry charge, meaning the battle would have to be decided mainly by the infantry. This was an extreme advantage to the allied side because as the defenders, all they had to do was stand their ground and prevent Philip from advancing, a strategy tailor-made for phalanx tactics. Despite this massive advantage, the battle was initially very even. Both sides clashed, and neither was able to break the other's formation. Eventually, the battle would be decided by the reforms Philip had introduced at the beginning of his reign. His professional troops were better disciplined, better trained, and being veterans of many campaigns, had higher stamina than their opponents. As the battle wore on, the flanks of the allies were gradually worn down, until their right flank was broken by the Macedonian left flank, led by Alexander. The troops that Alexander defeated on this side of the battle were led by the elite Sacred Band of Thebes. This Sacred Band was a group of 150 pairs of gay lovers who had been the most feared warriors during Thebes' rise to power. Their myth of invincibility ended in this battle, as all 300 were killed in the subsequent routing. It is quite a romantic piece of history that all the lovers died and were buried together. Philip's victory at the Battle of Chaeronea can be seen as the final conclusion of the narrative arc we have been following since the Ionian Revolt. The battle ended all possibility of resistance in Greece and led to the creation of the League of Corinth. This league comprised most of the central and southern Greek cities that had not already been conquered by Macedonia, and they chose Philip to be their leader. This meant, for the first time, the Hellenic world was de facto united under a single king, and his name was Philip II of Macedon. Ever the restless conqueror, the year after the creation of the League of Corinth, Philip began making preparations to invade Anatolia. He wished to regain the Greek cities that had been lost under the humiliating king's peace. The subjugated Greek cities rejoiced upon hearing the news that their brothers from the homeland were coming to deliver them from Persian tyranny. They rose up in revolt to help soften the way for Philip's inevitable arrival, but their fortune took a dramatic turn downward when they received word that Philip had been assassinated. He had ruled for 23 years and was one of the most transformative rulers, not just in Greek history, but world history. The historical record around Philip's death is predictably full of false narratives and obvious dramatic embellishments, as this may have been one of the most consequential assassinations in history. As far as we can tell, the only solid facts around his murder are that he was murdered by a member of his own bodyguard named Pausanias, and that the culprit was killed during his escape attempt. There are many fanciful tales of Pausanias being a rebuffed lover of Philip, or that Alexander and his mother had orchestrated the plot, but these stories have no factual basis. Whatever truly happened, the consequences remain the same. The Persian invasion would be postponed, as the man we would come to know as Alexander the Great was crowned Alexander III of Macedon. For the purposes of our story, I won't go into the full life and career of history's possibly greatest great man, but I would like to go over his story until he fatefully extends his conquest past Byzantium. Alexander was born on the 20th of July in the year 356 BC. His father was, as always, out on campaign, and not present for the birth of his heir. As with any great ruler, there is a mythos that obscures the true man, and the ancient Greeks were especially energetic about spinning these myths. There are many stories about how the gods sent dreams and peculiar events to mark the coming of Alexander, and that he would be destined for greatness. These stories are a helpful bit of propaganda that are used by any ruler to make themselves seem divinely chosen to rule, but in Alexander's case they were especially prominent due to how unbelievably successful he was later in life. Through his youth, Alexander was tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, who imbued in him a great love of learning. Alexander was especially fond of the Iliad, which may have inspired his adventurous campaigns later in life. At this early period in life, Alexander was also in contact with Persian exiles that had sought refuge in his father's court. These exiles taught him many of the intricacies of Persian politics that would come in handy when he conquered the empire. Alexander's education was cut a bit short by our standards because when he turned 16, he was put in charge of administering to the kingdom as its regent, while his father was off on campaign, which, as we have seen, was nearly all the time. Most of the events that are recorded from this period of his life are revolts and raids that he had to subdue. The routine maintenance of the kingdom was really an extension of Alexander's education, as he learned hands-on what it took to rule and lead armies. The first major campaign that Alexander joined his father on was also the last the two would fight together, as this was the expedition that ended with the Battle of Chaeronea and the unification of Greece. We already went over the role Alexander played in this battle. With a brief pause in the warring, Philip took the time to add another wife to his already 7 companions. This new wife was a Macedonian, unlike Alexander's mother, so any sons she had would be a potent threat to Alexander's position. This is likely where the myth of Alexander's plot to assassinate his father came from, as the possibility of a new heir was a good motive for regicide. However, this theory is thrown into question by the fact that Alexander went into self-imposed exile that ended after only 6 months when his father confirmed that he had no intention of disinheriting his eldest and most well-educated son. This confirmation lessened the uneasiness surrounding the succession, but it never truly remained unquestioned. That is, until the day Philip was assassinated and Alexander ascended to the throne. As was common at that time, the succession was a bloody and chaotic event. Many possible challengers to the throne were executed by either Alexander or his mother, and many restless cities took the opportunity to attempt to break away from Macedonian hegemony. There was no way that Alexander could resume his father's plans for an invasion of Asia Minor while his domestic situation was so turbulent, so he quickly raised an army of 3,000 cavalry. He rode south towards the Peloponnese Peninsula, putting down rebellious cities along his way and adding their troops to his army. He stopped in Corinth to renew the charter of the League of Corinth and accept the surrender of Athens. At Corinth, he also declared his intention to continue his father's plans of waging war against Persia. He had one more region to deal with before he could cross the Bosphorus Strait and make these plans a reality. Tribes on Macedonia's northern frontier had been a constant headache for previous monarchs, and now they were testing Alexander's authority. Leaving Corinth, Alexander marched first to Thrace, where he systematically defeated each subsequent rebel tribe until they were once again submissive. During this time, tribes in Illyria also rose up against their overlords, and Alexander was forced to march back west and put them down. Upon successfully defeating these tribes, there was at last peace in the northern provinces. However, Alexander's absence from the south sparked yet another revolt by Athens and Thebes. Being thoroughly fed up with this game of whack-a-mole that he had to play, Alexander showed no mercy to Thebes. He razed the city to the ground and distributed its lands to more loyal cities, effectively erasing it from the map and sending a potent message to any other uppity city that he was no longer willing to tolerate insubordination. 2 years after the death of his father and Alexander's ascension to the throne, he had finally brought a tenuous peace to his realm. Now it was time for him to cross into the east and fulfill his destiny. But first he made a quick pit stop to add Byzantium to his list of conquests. This time, Byzantium had no hope of aid from Athens, and the Persians were much too focused on defending their holdings in Anatolia to spare any help for the Byzantines. Thus, the city fell back into Greek hands, and would remain that way until the arrival of the Romans. Since the crossing of the Hellespont marks the last time Alexander would set foot in Greece proper, we will leave his story after a brief synopsis of his further campaigns. Alexander began his unbroken string of battlefield victories at the Battle of Granicus in 334 BC. Over the next 11 years, he would expand his empire at a lightning pace, taking Syria, the Levant, Persia, and Egypt. His conquests reached as far east as the Indian subcontinent, and were only stopped when Alexander's army grew tired of campaigning and demanded they return home. Reluctantly, Alexander agreed, but he would never make it back to Greece, as he died in Babylon at the tender age of 32. Undoubtedly, he had one of the most extraordinary lives in history, and we can only ever guess at what might have been if he had lived longer. The consequences of his unprecedented expansion of the Hellenic Empire were numerous. For one, Greek ideas spread east to all the lands that he entered. But this spread was not a one-way street, and many Eastern ideas also made their way west, in turn influencing the way Greek and later European cultures developed. Just as important as the actual scale of his conquests was the legend that grew out of them. Alexander would inspire great men of history centuries and even millennia after his death. Possibly the most fervent of Alexander's fanboys were the Roman emperors, who idolized and tried to emulate his mythical figure. In the more immediate term, Alexander's uncertain instructions on how he should be succeeded meant his death immediately threw the empire into chaos. He is reported to have said on his deathbed that he should be succeeded by, quote, the strongest one, end quote, which each of his generals, governors, bodyguards, and pretty much anyone with a sword and a name believed to mean them. For the sake of our story, I will only mention one by name. Lysimachus was one of Alexander's bodyguards and a close friend. During the partition of Babylon, the empire was divided up by all the leading men, and Lysimachus received governance over Thrace, which included the city of Byzantium. As can be expected, this partition created a slew of competing governors who each sought to expand his territory at the expense of his neighbors, so war was inevitable. Over the next few decades, the different Greek states would fight amongst themselves, until by 301 BC, there were only a few left. Lysimachus actually came out pretty well ahead at the end of these conflicts, and expanded his kingdom to most of western Anatolia and the entirety of the southern coast of the Black Sea. His kingdom would not survive long after his death, however, and in the preceding tumultuous decades, no other large state would take control of Thrace. Instead, the lands were held by a smattering of Thracian tribes and independent Greek cities. One such city was Byzantium, who joined a federation of Greek cities called the Northern League, and seemed content with growing rich off the prosperous trade through the Bosporus Strait. It is here where we begin winding down our time in the Greek period of our story. Next time, we will discuss the gradual process in which the Roman Republic conquered and integrated the Greek lands into their empire. The Hellenic Empire had been the largest and strongest state in the world at the time of Alexander the Great's death, but with that success there were problems. The rapid expansion of the Greek world led to a mass exodus of citizens, most importantly ambitious men and soldiers, from mainland Greece to the more prosperous and exciting provinces. This left the homeland relatively weak and impoverished, which was further exacerbated by the decades of war that followed Alexander's death. As the great migration of talent moved east, the old Hellenic cities gradually dulled. Sparta, Athens, Byzantium, Thebes had all suffered generations of conflict and were now being sapped by the promise of greater opportunity in Asia and Egypt. Byzantium was able to maintain their prominence as a leading Greek city, largely due to their position as the gatekeepers of the Bosporus Strait, but they could not muster the strength to claim the mantle of Greek capital. By the time the Romans began looking east, there was no united Greek state that could easily oppose them. In fact, before they even sent any troops to the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea, many independent cities, including Byzantium, had already declared themselves under the protection of the Roman Republic. But that is a story for next time.
As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Byzantium.